Good to see you, everyone. My name is Robbie Howell. I am a game designer and a lover of history, normally doing Age of Empires 2 theory crafting. But you know what I like even more than history? Mythology. And as such, the upcoming release of AOM Retold gives me a perfect opportunity to start to speculate. I'd like to share with you my top 5 guesses for what cultures I think are going to be added in Age of Mythology Retold. Specifically, my top 5. You may notice that this is a bit of a different style than my normal videos, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you think this looks for potential future Age of Mythology style content. And if you want to see more Age of Mythology videos on this channel, I have posted in conjunction with this video 3 different polls in the community tab. So if you want to influence what you're going to see on this channel for the next 2 or so months until Retold drops, go vote and let me know what you want to see most. Or whether you don't want to see Age of Mythology content at all, that is completely fine as well. Let us proceed! As always, we're going to start with a brief summary of my approach, if I were to do Age of Mythology builds and content. As I like to be true to the history with Age of Empires, I would want to be true to the myths with Age of Mythology, trying to be as faithful as possible to the source material that these myths come from within the confines of the game. I don't want to change something just for the sake of balance. Additionally, I'm going to be trying to go for what I think would be believable additions to the game. I know nothing about modding Age of Mythology, so I don't really have a good litmus test there, but I'll still try to stick with what seems legit. I am a hobbyist, not a classicist, though I do know mythology better than history. There's still tons of gaps in my knowledge, and I'm quite rusty. So apologies in advance for any mistakes. And if you want to support me in this sort of content here on the channel, along with my normal Age of Empires 2 endeavors, you can leave a comment, like the video, do all that bullshit. It always helps in the algorithm, as well as subscribe if you want to see more. But on top of that, you can join our Discord server and support me over on Ko-Fi. Link to all of that down in the description below. And with that, a few clarifications before we jump into my list. For one, this is a predictive list, not a prescriptive list. I'm going for what seems likely to me, and if left up to me, I would make many different choices. The summaries I'm going to give for these cultures are going to be incredibly surface level, so apologies for all like the dramatic oversimplification I'm going to be having to do. It's going to be misleading, don't take it as gospel truth. I was going to include a Chinese rework on this list, but they announced that that's going to happen before I got around to recording the video. So, yeah, just know I was expecting that. And, of course, my opinions here on this list are 100% objective fact, and so you cannot disagree in any way, shape, or form. This is final. And like I said, if you want to see any more Age of Mythology content on this channel, go vote in the 3 polls up in the community tab. I'm going to be committing to, before Retold comes out, 1 full build, another 1 or 2 like core videos on interesting topics that I think are relevant, and maybe 1 or 2 optional funsy videos. I'm hoping to get at least 3 or 4 Age of Mythology vids out before Retold is released. Oops, my presentation says per month. No, not per month, that would be ridiculous. But if you want more than that, or you want less than that, let me know in the poll, let me know in the comments. And if people are really enjoying it, I might continue doing Age of Mythology content even after Retold releases. Don't worry if you're just here for Age of Empires, those videos shall not dry up. Now, let's begin with the guesses. Starting with number 5 on my list. Number 5, the 5th most likely civilization I think could be added to the game, the Gaels. Referring to specifically the Gaelic subgroup of the Celtic peoples who live in the British Isles, the Irish and the Scottish, as well as others besides. Now, this is number 5 on the list for a reason. I think that the Gaels are a good possibility because they are at least somewhat common knowledge. Like, most people who have played Age of Mythology have probably heard of, like, you know, Kelpies or prominent cultural touchstones that source from Gaelic mythology. And I feel like it hits the spot between familiar and foreign that Age of Mythology really wants to play with. Indeed, when I did a bunch of Gaelic Age of Empires builds on my channel, people seem to really enjoy learning about them. There is also the other point that the Gaels have close proximity to the Norse. And I don't just mean physical proximity. They are a somewhat related culture, much like the Greeks, Egyptians, and Atlanteans, I guess, are all kind of geographically and culturally linked together. So this would give the Norse a neighbor that would kind of entwine them deeper into the rest of the game, if that makes sense. Now, on the other hand, I don't think the Gaels are perfectly likely because I think Celts is probably a more likely addition. Though it hurts my soul. This is the one place on this list I'm putting something down the way I want it to be rather than the way I think it will be. There were so many different Celts, and they were so different from each other. it would piss me off if they were added as Celts. But I mean, better it be Celts than not feature these cultures whatsoever. The other thing that I think is like a counterexample, or something going against the Gaels, is that people might be sick of Europe. And this is like a frequent discussion point in AoE 2. I don't know how prominent it is in the Age of Mythology community, but the rest of the world really does have so much to offer. It would be kind of a shame to just stick with more of Europe for now. I could see the Gaels, or Celts, being added like 3 or 4 civilizations down the line rather than immediately because of this in particular. Now, what do I think the Gaels might look like? Here is my personal proposal. I think that for core mechanics, they would have fast armies with few heavy troops and mostly like light, not fodder, right? But hit and run style troops. Big emphasis on mobility and with some unique mechanics for things like stealth, passing forests, amphibiousness, etc., both in myth units and human units. I could see them having not a fantastic economy, but having a lot of benefits for plundering, letting them draw resources from fighting enemy soldiers or attacking villagers or something like that. For heroes, I think it would make most sense for them to have Rigfenid. These were the leaders of warrior groups called the Fien. And my idea is that the Rigfenid would have like a group that kind of spawned around them that would kind of be buffed while they were together and would spawn more periodically as the group fights and pillages. So it's kind of a hero with a group that is like locked to them, if that makes sense. So you have to use them kind of as one. Now, would this be fussy? Yes. And because of this, I could see them also going for like a High King of Ireland sort of thing, and Ardri would be the term you would use for it. Kind of like a pharaoh, but with like buffs based on your god choice maybe. Maybe a bad HP pool to represent the fact that the High Kings of Ireland had to be unblemished, like if you even got a cut, according to myth, you would be disbarred from the role. And I'll mention another option for this a little later. For their favor mechanic, I think it would be most interesting if they had holy wells, like a really small stealth building that generated favor when it was near working villagers, but if an enemy destroyed it, it would give them a favor bounty of some kind. So it wouldn't be just straight like a monument or something boring like that. Instead, you'd want to position these close to your economy and hope that the enemy didn't find them, or maybe like purposefully destroy them before the enemy got to them or something like that. Now I should note, you could also do something like holy groves or do some druidic stuff for favor. That's totally viable, but holy groves were enormously common, like all over the world. Everywhere from Japan to Africa had holy groves. So I think it's way less specific and way less interesting because of that. And in terms of like a druidic system, this was part of the reason I wanted to go with Gaels rather than Celts, because all the Celts use druids, and I think that keeping a druidic system for something like the Gauls rather than the Gaels would make a little more sense to me, at least. In terms of their gods, my guess is their 3 main gods would probably be Dagda, who's like the chief of the gods in Irish mythology specifically, Cailleach, who's like a winter crone. She was known as Beira in Scotland, and she's a really interesting character, kind of representing storms and seasons, very complicated figure. And lastly, Balor. And Balor was a Fomorian, so almost like a giant in Norse mythology, like a Abadi. And Balor was known for his one massive eye that laid destruction to huge swaths of land. For minor gods, there's a whole ton of them, but some of the ones I wanted to highlight would be Boan, who was the wife of Dagda, Ingus, who is the god of love, Brigid, she did everything, kind of like an Athena equivalent almost, but even more important. Nuada, who's kind of like Tyr in the Norse pantheon, but he was like I think he was the original high king of the gods, and then he lost his hand, and so he had to relinquish his kingship. Mananan, who is like a sea god who was also like a psychopomp ferrying you to the otherworld, but like a heavenly otherworld, like a happy place otherworld. Another really interesting character. And of course, Morrigan. You can't have the Gaels without Morrigan, the triplicate goddess representing war and death and fate and all sorts of interesting things. Now, any of you who know Gaelic mythology and Celtic mythology more broadly will notice some big omissions from my list here, such as Ogma and Lu, but these are more broad-scale Celtic gods that I would personally want to save for other factions, but assuming we didn't get a specific Gaelic faction and just got a Celtic one, I would fully expect to see gods like Ogma and Lu here instead of some of the ones I have proposed. Now for myth unit guesses, one of the things that I think make the Gaels such a great fit for Age of Mythology is the gigantic number of mythical creatures, and just some of the most common ones that I would most expect to see would be things like the Kelpie, which is the shape-shifting water horse, the Dullahan, which is like a terrifying headless horseman that you see in the Northern Isles, and the Elaine Treshant, which is like a 3-headed monster bird, give them a cool high damage flying unit. But in terms of some final other notes on the Gaels, You may also notice, if you know anything about Gaelic mythology, an absence of the she, or the fairy folk. I propose, I don't think this is likely, I think in an official build that had the Gaels would almost certainly have the she. I think they could actually be their own civilization, kind of like Atlantis. Like, if we can justify having a nonsensical fiction land that is only barely faithful to Greek mythology, then I think that like a parallel to the Gaels faction that has a ton of mythological backing makes abundant sense. And the Sidhe were like a parallel society to the human Gaels in the mythology. I really doubt this would happen. And so if the Gaels were added and somehow weren't just called the Celts, you can definitely expect shit like leprechauns and banshees and all that happy horseshit. But that's my guess for the Gaels. Let's now move on to number 4. The fourth most likely guess for what will be added, the Romans. Now, a couple qualifications for this one. Why do I think the Romans are likely to be added? 1, beyond a doubt, mass appeal. People love Rome. It's super well known, tons of name recognition, and that does matter. 2 is precedent. A lot of the arguments against the Romans that I would make, like they're lazy and reductive, are all kind of countered by the existence of the Atlanteans, who are also lazy and reductive. And I do also think that there is a way to make them very mechanically unique from the other existing civilizations, even if not thematically so. Now, the last thing I'm going to add here, and this is probably my weakest justification for any of these, is past expectations. I don't know if you guys were in the same boat, but when I was a child and I had played and loved Age of Mythology, I heard there was an expansion coming out, and I remember talking to my friends, who's going to get added? And I was convinced that the mystical fourth civilization was going to be the Romans. Am I the only one who thought that? I was convinced. I was certain it was going to happen. When it's like Atlanteans, they aren't even real. Like, that's stupid. And so, again, this might be kind of a stretch, but I feel like this sort of nostalgic expectation payoff absolutely sells copies. Like it says on screen, look at Smash Bros. Were any of you playing Melee when the mythical "you can unlock Sonic in Melee" thing came about? And what do they do in Brawl? They added Sonic. Ooh, that's so exciting. It helped sell copies. And I feel like the Romans might fall into a similar boat here. Now, on the other hand, I have some issues with the Romans. I don't want them added. Please don't add the Romans, at least not yet. I feel like it would just be another lazy Hellenic rehash. Much like the Atlanteans, I think they might even be worse than the Atlanteans in terms of their overall creative contribution to the game. There are so many more deserving cultures in the world, and as popular as Rome is, I feel like a lot of people agree with this sentiment of there are more deserving civilizations, and Rome would be silly to add. The other thing, which is a much less important point, and they're already kind of in the game. The Atlanteans have some blatantly Roman elements, things like the Mormillo, the Turma, the Caladria. These are all explicit Romans references. So maybe that disbars them entirely. I'm not sure. Now, if the Romans were added, here's how I would personally go about designing them. I feel like as their core mechanic, they should be extremely human-focused, with relatively weak myth units mostly playing supportive roles. I feel like it would give that a more vanilla experience. For their heroes, I would propose a praetor. You could call it a consul as well. I feel like praetor is a little better because consul wasn't a title that was used until mid-Republican era, I believe. And I see this as being a tough aura hero that boosts humans and especially gives nearby humans better advantage against enemy myth units so that you don't have to worry as much about enemy myth units just stomping your human-focused army. I thought it would be cool if the praetor was elected at a town center. Namely, it could only be trained when you had villagers garrisoned in the town center. I thought that was super cool. I also thought it would be cool if you got to have up to 2, mirroring the consuls as well as Romulus and Remus. For favor, this is, I think, my most controversial suggestion. I think their favor should be adopted from the opponent. So if you're facing the Norse, you get favor by fighting just like the Norse would. If you're facing Greeks, you pray at the temple, etc. What happens if you're in a game with multiple factions or all the factions? You can do all of it just worse than any of the source civilizations. Now, why the heck do I propose this for the Romans? Well, they were kind of notorious for just kind of slapping a coat of Roman paint over all of the local cultures that they conquered and just kind of letting them do their own thing. So I feel like that practice of appealing to the local gods of whatever culture you're currently trying to conquer is quite unique and creative and will help the Romans feel, again, a little more human-focused and vanilla. Now, in terms of god guesses, I really feel like if they were to add the Romans, they would have to make them as different as possible from the Greeks. And here's how I'd personally do it. You make their major, the Capitoline triad of Jupiter. I mean, it's Zeus, but still, Jupiter of the Romans was slightly different. He had different implications. Juno, she was very important to Rome, more important than Hera was to Greece. And Minerva, because she was, again, even more important to Rome than Athena was to most of Greece besides Athens. They're the big three. In terms of minor, Hercules was actually deified in Rome. You could use Janus. He's where we get the calendar word for January from, and he was also very prominent in Rome. It's kind of a protective and auspicious patron. You could have Ceres for farming. We don't see Demeter on the Greeks, so that's an open field there. Mars is obviously very important. They saw him differently. And I also think it would be cool if you actually could have Romulus and Remus as a god. I was thinking it would be cool if they had a power where, like, you could turn your praetors into Romulus and Remus, kind of like a Son of Osiris type thing. And so, as you can see, it's kind of a more human-centric pantheon. And Rome really did see its gods as very, very different from how Greece did, even if many of them had similar names, and many of them had very similar backgrounds. If you didn't want to do like old Rome and you were willing to bring it into like Caesarian Rome, the Caesars were to some degree deified as well. You could even throw them in there. And I could even see, though I wouldn't do this myself, a god tree that directly paralleled the Greeks. You have the same gods in the same places, but you rename and they do kind of different stuff. I think this is lazy and dumb, but it's something I kind of expect them to do. Now, in terms of some myth unit guesses, like I said, they should be weaker, more support-based myth units. For example, the Aquila, which is the Roman eagle. Imagine like an eagle that flies above your army and buffs everyone, but doesn't fight itself. That seems very appropriate. Similarly, the idea of the Lemur, like the Evil Dead, the shade almost, but like a more aggressive shade, I think would be a really interesting thing to reference here. As well as having, instead of the aggressive satyrs that you see on Atlantis, you could have fauns, which would be more supportive and maybe helping them find paths and stuff. As well as some of the weird animals chronicled by Pliny the Elder, like the catoblepas, which is, it was probably them just seeing a wildebeest and saying, wow, this thing stinks to high hell, but it was like a wildebeest of doom. It had the laser eyes, it had the poison breath. Some final notes on the Romans. Much as I would personally deprioritize them, like way deprioritize them, I must emphasize that there are ways to make this culture work and do it right, do it justice. I really hope that if this civilization is added, they do their utmost to make it as unique as possible, both thematically and mechanically. Please do the Romans justice if they are to be added. And I think it would also probably need to be paired with an Atlantean overhaul, because again, there's a lot of crossover, which is good, because again, I think the Atlanteans are dumb. Mechanically fun, but thematically dumb. Now, past the controversial stuff, onto the stuff I think is very likely. Number 3, the Sumerians. So, why the Sumerians? What makes me think they are a likely pick? Well, first of all, they have the correct feel. They have the myths, they have the pantheon, which lends itself to the way Age of Mythology works. They have geographic proximity to Egypt and Greece. You can bundle in some other potential civilizations like Akkad and Assyria and Babylon and even Canaan. Now, I hope they don't do this, because I think most of those civilizations deserve their own entries in the game, but I could see it being something that they choose to do. And because of that, you could maybe see the civilization named Mesopotamians, but I think that name is kind of clunky. Sumerians is a lot cleaner. You could even maybe sneakily bundle in some Abrahamic stuff in there without running the risk of falling into hot water for having an Abrahamic civilization in the game, which I think would be really cool to many people, but would also likely be seen as very disrespectful. The last thing I think makes the Sumerians a likely candidate is temporal breadth. They are a much older religion and culture than Greece. They're like not much older than Egypt, but they are older still, and it kind of helps the game go, back to the roots. Show a big variety of civilizations across time periods as well as geographic proximity. Now, on the other hand, they are again already kind of featured. The Egyptians have some Mesopotamian references and elements in them. Most notably, the Scorpion Man is the one I had off the top of my head. And additionally, this might seem dumb when you compare it to Atlantis, but I could see people saying, oh, they feel too similar to Egypt, guys. No, they're really not. But I've heard worse arguments. So I could see people shying away from them on that basis. Now, in terms of how I personally would implement the Sumerians, I think it would be cool if they were extremely town center focused, with each town center being like a city-state, you know what I mean? Now, because of this, they wouldn't have drop camps, except for the temple, which I'll get to in a moment. The TC instead would give you bonus resources if your villagers were hoofing it all the way back there. So this way, they have a very vulnerable economy, But they get like more bang for their buck out of their resources because you're kind of stuck with like schlepping them long distance back. I think that would be super cool. And would represent kind of the worst infrastructure of the era. I think it would also make sense for them to have large armies, like low population armies, with chariots being the only real cavalry. And for their heroes, I think it would be great if they had god kings. And so what this would be is every time you built a TC, you would get a god king at that TC that was like bound to it. And it would level up and get better as more resources were dropped at that TC. They would have like auras, and maybe if they died, you could bring them back with some favor or something like that. But it would be like really powerful single heroes that are linked to a TC. And if your TC is destroyed, you'd lose that god king. I think it would be sick. In terms of my proposal for their favor mechanic, I think temples should serve as drop points, but whenever you drop a resource at that temple, it converts the resource to favor. And so this way, you can get a lot of favor very fast, but it taxes your overall economy a lot more, and it wastes the resources. But since you get extra returns from your TCs, it could be seen as a good payoff when you need the favor. Because of this, I think the Sumerians would have some of the best access to myth units in the game, which feels sensible to me somehow, and also still makes their economy an interesting balancing act. Like, it's not just strictly better to do one way or the other. You could also do something with ziggurats. Ziggurats are obviously very iconic. Maybe temples are replaced by a building called a ziggurat. Or maybe a temple can upgrade into a ziggurat that has these mechanics and maybe only takes like a portion of the resources as favor and the rest you get as actual resources. There's a bunch of ways you can do it, and it would be a shame to have this civilization without ziggurats in it. In terms of some god examples, I'd say the big three for me for Sumeria would be Enlil. He's like, king of the gods, sky father sort of thing. Enki, who's a water god but has Prometheus-like elements of being kind of a trickster and being a friend to man and giving men gifts to help them like uplift themselves. And Inanna, also known as Ishtar, the goddess of war and love. She's very important. She features prominently in the Epic of Gilgamesh. In terms of some minor gods, you could do ones like Nisaba, who's kind of writing and farming. Ereshkigal, she's pretty famous. She's the goddess of the underworld. Ishkur, who's a rain god. And then the last three I wanted to mention, I think it would be great for their mythic age gods if each god was a god of a city, which was a pretty common thing in Mesopotamia. So Ashur was the god of Akkad. Marduk was the god of Babylon, and Baal was the god of Lagash, or I think she was a goddess, actually, can't remember. Anyways, you'd have these patron deities of specific city-states, and in-game what that would mean is once you got a Mythic Age god, you could, like, promote one of your existing town centers into, like, a full proper city-state. And you have, like, super big bonuses, but you have to choose one, and then it's themed around the Mythic Age god you picked. Something like that. I think that would be super-duper sick as, like, the patron city of your chosen Mythic Age god. Or maybe even you have this be a thing for all gods. Anytime you age up, you get to pick a TC as the patron city for the god you picked. I think it would be sick. In terms of some myth unit examples, there's actually a good number. The Lamassu is a pretty common one. It's kind of chimera-like, but it's a protective creature rather than a destructive one, and it can fly. You have examples like Humbaba, who was an ogre who Gilgamesh fought with Enkidu. The Anzu, which was like a flying creature that was made of both fire and water. And also the Mashkim. I actually didn't know about this one until I looked into it. This was like a wind demon, almost. I think it could be really, really sick. So they have some great variety with myth units, and since you have the potential to dump favor, you could get to them really, really consistently, which I think would be quite cool and make them a nice contrast to existing civilizations. Some final notes on the Sumerians. Instead of doing the gods that I have proposed here, you could also go with kind of the Mesopotamian primordials like An and Tiamat and Abzu, maybe in addition to the core gods, but I think probably as like a separate roster. You could even have references to them in myth units like you do with the Norse with their Fenris brood and their Jormungandr Elvers and stuff like that. So there's a couple ways you could do that, or you could just have multiple Mesopotamian factions that each kind of play into different sides of that. Just saying. And additionally, even though he's not featuring in this build as stated right here, Enkidu is needed somewhere. I think, we have like the main globetrotting campaign where you just meet a bajillion characters all across mythology. Enkidu should be the guy you pick up, the de facto party dude in the Sumerian section of that campaign. I think it would be awesome. Enkidu is such a bro. And that's the Sumerians done. We're getting to the top two. Number two, the Japanese. They and the number one are the two by far and away most likely candidates for the new faction that will be added in Retold. And let me tell you a little bit about why. Now, Japan has a great amount of pop culture presence. There's a lot higher awareness of Japanese myth than there was 20 years ago, thanks to anime and video games. Japanophilia in general is quite high from where I can tell and based on where I'm from. And again, kind of like I mentioned with regional pairings earlier, they're kind of a regional pair with China. China's being reworked, might get a new campaign to go along with it, and so giving it a new neighbor that makes kind of proximate sense for that campaign seems very likely. Though, of course, cross-world contact is very doable in Age of Mythology, but remember, 3 of the original 4 civilizations, Atlantis, Egypt, and Greece, were very, very clustered. And more importantly than any of that, unbelievable potential. There is so many options for both human and myth units alike. You have like enough material in Japanese mythology to make like 2 to 3 complete tech trees. It's a really incredibly distinct and well-documented culture that I think would be beautifully transposed onto Age of Mythology. Now, on the other hand, this is a modern religion. We cannot forget that Shintoism is still practiced in Japan. It's not like a huge religion, it's not super prominent, but it is still an important one, and you'd need to approach it respectfully when you were doing this build. So I will say Japan itself seems to have zero problem depicting Shintoism in its own media. And so maybe look to those sort of examples of what Shinto elements are shown in modern Japanese media to see what would be respectful and okay to include. Or get a cultural consultant if you're really scared. I know you have the money for it, Microsoft. Now, in terms of how I personally would implement the Japanese, I think it makes more sense if they have very varied armies with awesome infantry, archers, and cavalry, but bad siege. I think they would have really foddery fodder and really elite elites. So that you could make big trash armies if you wanted, or you could stomp people flat with extremely powerful, expensive human units. I also think it would make sense for them to have a ton of variety in their myth units, with most gods having like 2 to 3 instead of the normal 1. Now, in terms of heroes, my proposal are descendants. And what this would be is you'd start the game with one and get 1 more per age, and this would be themed around the god you picked that age. So your starting god, you get a descendant of that god. Then your classical age god, you get a descendant of that one. And so the god that your descendant is derived from would influence what unit type it is, infantry, archer, cavalry, or support, and influence its specific powers. Japanese gods were the ancestors of the Japanese people. The two intermingled a lot more in Japan than you see in other parts of the world, or at least more regularly. And so because of that, I feel like having heroes represent direct descendants of gods makes most sense for this faction. Although, again, might be disrespectful to the royal family of Japan. I don't know whether that's the case, but just something to think about. For favor, I think they should build shrines. These would be generating favor over time, kind of like a monument, but it would start being really sharty. And over time, the shrine would be upgraded as a kami comes to house in it. Kami being like a Shinto spirit. The max number of shrines you could build would be based on settlements, and over time they could be promoted based on what the kami likes. And in general, kami would like being near untouched resources, so you put them near like secluded woods and gold mines you're not going to get to for a while, away from other buildings and units, so you try to leave them alone, and being unattacked. I misspelled. It should say unattacked rather than unattached. And so if you can seclude your shrines somewhere and keep them protected, you're going to get a shit ton of favor, way more than a monument would generate for the Egyptians. And like I said, they could upgrade over time to improve output. In terms of some guesses for the Japanese gods, the big 3 of Japan are Amaterasu, the goddess of the sun, Tsukuyomi, the god of the moon, and Susanoo, the god of the sea and storms and a bunch of other stuff. For minor gods, there's a lot you could pick from, but some of the ones I wanted to focus on would be Ebisu, a god of fishing and luck, Tenjin, a god of learning and kind of a lot of other stuff. A lot of these gods are a god of tons of stuff. I'm being super simplistic here. Konohana, who's a goddess of volcanoes. Ryujin, who's a dragon of the ocean. Hachiman, who's seen as like the defender of Japan. And Sarutahiko, who's a god of strength and the leader of the earthly kami as opposed to the heavenly kami. So there are tons of different options for their core pantheon. For some myth unit examples, once again, Japan has endless options. You have the Kappa, the water goblin. If you played Pokemon, that's what Lombre and Ludicolo are representing. The Oni are the classic Japanese evil ogre demon spirits. Kitsune, the fox tricksters, most people know those. Tengu, who's like, it's kind of complicated to describe Tengu. They were like a avian, but also had monkey-like features, but were seen as quite noble, but also kind of naughty. Very complicated topic, but a flyer. The tanuki, a very troublemaking raccoon with a kind of overinflated sex drive. And my personal favorite, the namazu, which is like a giant catfish that caused earthquakes. I think that would be a sick unit. And also, I believe there are myths of namazu crawling onto land, so it wouldn't be confined to water. A final note on Japanese myth units, I could see them having a completely different model than for anywhere else in the world. Like I said, what if Japan had a ton of different types of myth units, and they were on average much cheaper, but they had less raw power. So you have a lot of options, a lot of variety, and you can spam them. That feels appropriate, to me at least, to the way that mythical creatures seem to arise within Japanese myth. They seem to be kind of everywhere. And kami are, of course, in Shinto tradition, part of almost everything. So why not give people a shit ton of kami to play with? I think that would be awesome. But before we get to number one, now that Japanese are done, let's talk about some honorable mentions. Some civilizations that I thought about adding to this list, but I didn't for one reason or another. For starters, in no particular order, the Hindus. Now, Hindu mythology is amazing, but here's the thing, it's no more mythology than Abrahamic tradition is. And I could see it being included in a game like this being seen as insanely disrespectful, as this is a modern religion with well over 1 billion practitioners. If there were a way to implement Hindu religion into this game that would be actually well received by Hindus, this would be my number one pick on this list. But as is, I don't think you could tackle anything in India unless you had some strong cultural consultants on your side who could help you make sure that it was done in a fitting and respectful manner. Now, beyond the Hindus, the Polynesians. I think this would have been my number 6. They have incredible potential, but they would require a very weird tech tree. I did an Age of Empires build for the Polynesians with a great collaborator, and it was certainly hard to overcome their complete lack of siege, for example, which is an important part of the game. Maybe the myth units could kind of cover that option for them. Another option, the Yoruba. We really want to see some African representation. African religion is awesome. And the Yoruba religion is probably the best known, but that is largely because of its association with voodoo, which would maybe be taken poorly. I think including it would run the risk of falling into lazy tropes that people would not be happy to see. The last one I wanted to highlight were the Slavs, or a Slavic culture. This would probably have been number 7 on my list. Not because there's not enough material, there's tons of material. I think that this would be a fantastic addition to the game, but I just don't know if people would be as excited about it. I would, but I feel like if there was going to be more Europe, it probably wouldn't be Eastern Europe. Though I hope I'm wrong. And there are many, many more ideas besides that I wanted to feature on this list, but just didn't have space to do. There are at least 6 other really good options that I haven't brought up once in this video. Plus, at least 30 more contenders that I brainstormed over a couple of days that might be even slightly feasible to add to the game down the line. Who knows how many I haven't even thought of myself. And so, if you want to see more Age of Mythology on this channel, I got tons of ideas that I want to share with you, and I hope you're excited to see them. Now, with all that said, let's move to number 1. My number 1 guess for a new culture to be added to Age of Mythology Retold is the Aztecs. Pretty obvious. I feel like everyone saw this coming. Why the Aztecs? Well, honestly, why not the Aztecs? First of all, accessibility. I feel like most people have at least some idea of Aztec myth, even if it is often very wrong. There's a low chance of pissing someone off by including the Aztecs, because I don't think there are any active practitioners, and I really don't think there is a better American representative than the Aztecs. Like Age of Empires, I'm sure Age of Mythology wants to cover as much of the globe as possible down the line. Another big reason, the religious structure. It would be so much easier to port the Aztecs into the Age of Mythology framework than most, if not all, other American faith traditions. The Aztecs just have more name brand value. They'd be a lot easier to research than any other American myth system, and I feel like that says a lot to their viability. Lastly, I have not played it, but I know for a fact there is a fan mod for a complete Aztec civilization. I'm not going to look at it or touch it till I do my own build, even if that takes years to do. The franchise, Age of Empires in general, Age of Mythology, all the Age games, has a proven track record of taking fan builds into heavy account when making decisions of what to add to the game. Obviously, Age of Empires 2, as we know it today, would not exist were it not for fan mods, and I feel like the Age franchise, though it sometimes forgets these roots, normally does a good job of upholding them. And so I feel like the fact that there's a well-liked fan mod for the Aztecs says a lot for their viability. And on the other hand, I would say there is no other hand. This is, in my objective opinion, the obvious pick for what civilization is going to be added in Age of Mythology Retold first. Now, how would I do the Aztecs? Well, I feel like it's relatively straightforward. I would personally give them notably cheap villagers, maybe taking like below 1 population each. I think I'd give them a huge focus on infantry with a lot of different types of infantry in various specialized roles. I feel like one of their core mechanics should be about taking prisoners in war, which they can then sacrifice or use for ransoming. And for their heroes, this is one of my favorite ideas, I think they should have the Nahual. These are shape-shifting wizards. This is not the right word for it, but a wizard, but a support caster that can change into an animal form. When it's in human form, it can't fight very well, but it has some cool spells and abilities. When it turns into an animal form, it's fast, it's dangerous, but it takes anti-myth unit damage, though it is still a hero. They'd be expensive, they'd be slow to train, but you can have a lot of them, kind of like a Herser. And the types of Nahual you'd have available would be based on your god, because all Aztec gods, or at least all that I know of, have some sort of animal they are affiliated with. You could also maybe do like a high priest thing if you want, or like a god incarnate thing, because a lot of the Aztec like hero myths are about their gods. But I think that the Nahual idea would be way more interesting. And also, don't forget, guys, Egypt has priests, so no other faction could have priests. Stupid. Now, in terms of how they get their favor, it's pretty obvious. They do sacrificing stuff. You bring a human unit to a temple, you kill him, and you get favor. Easy peasy, squeeze the lemon. If anyone gets that reference, put it in the comments. I know that sacrificing is overdone, but I feel like you kind of have to have it. I don't think you could put the Aztecs in game without doing something like this, and if you did, people would probably be much less happy with them. It's kind of lame, but it's true. And I think there are ways to make it interesting and done right. In terms of their god guesses, I think the Aztecs should start with 4 core gods in their pantheon. You have Quetzalcoatl, who does a lot more than just being like, oh, he came back. No, he was like a god of wisdom, a god of priesthood. He kind of had some sun god elements. He did a lot of stuff. Tezcatlipoca, I think, is arguably even more important. He was the god of night and fate and prophecy, and also, from what I understand, was the best candidate for an Aztec king of the gods, which they didn't really have otherwise. Then, of course, Tlaloc, the god of rain and fertility, who got a lot of sacrifices way back in the day, and Huitzilopochtli, who is a god of war, again had some sun elements, and was a very, very important god for the militant Aztec Empire as they were expanding out. He also has affiliation with the hummingbird, which I think is a very cool fun fact. Now for some minor gods, the ones that I chose to highlight here would be Mixcoatl, who is a god of the hunt, Chalchiutlicue, who is a goddess of water and rivers, Xipetotec, who is a god of agriculture, though kind of a life-death thing, because he like flayed his own skin to feed people. Gross, but cool. Chantico, who's a goddess of the hearth, war, volcanoes, a bunch of other stuff. Xolotl, who is like a psychopomp, a god of storms and fire, who leads people to the afterlife and was a twin brother to Quetzalcoatl. They had a lot of like misadventures together. And Coatlicue, who's like an earth mother. She's called the snake mother. Got decapitated, the blood coming out of her neck became snakes, gave birth to a bunch of gods. A cool incarnation of that particular overarching monomyth. In terms of some myth units the Aztecs could have, you might think, oh, I've never heard of an Aztec myth unit before. There's a ton of them. I think the Ahuitzotl is the most obvious one. It was like a water dog type thing that would lure you in and drag you down to the depths. And actually, an Aztec emperor was later called Ahuitzotl. Another one. I know this sounds dumb, but I think this is not something I want. It's something I think is likely. I think that if they added the Aztecs, they'd put the Chupacabra in there. Yes, it is a modern cryptid. I think they'd do it. There's a lot of name recognition to that one. The Quetzalcoatl, I think, is a much more interesting option. It's like a frog warrior that was born of a dying leviathan. And then the Tzipactli, who is like this massive sea monster. Some final notes on the Aztecs. Like the Norse, I think they'd want at least one non-hero specialist against myth units, like a Jarl equivalent. Maybe more than one. Because again, my proposal for the Nahual is that they would be more of a support unit until you entered their animal form, at which point they would become more vulnerable to anti-myth damage themselves. So I think the Aztecs would want another myth counter in case the Nahuals were more supportive in nature overall. And I also think it would be really fun to have the Aztecs be an opportunity to play around with activated powers in Age of Mythology. For an example of what I'm talking about, see the Wrath unit in Age of Empires 2, a chariot that with a press of a button can swap from melee mode to bow mode. And I feel like Age of Mythology is a shoo-in for these sorts of mechanics, arguably even more than Age of Empires 2, much more even, because of its smaller army sizes, existence of powers, though always with a charge bar instead, and, from what I can tell, higher micro in terms of competitive gameplay. And with that, we come to the end of my Age of Mythology Retold predictions. Thank you guys so much for watching. How did you like my guesses? Do you think they were reasonably compelling? Do you think there are any cultures I missed out on? And if so, I want to hear your guesses. What do you think is more likely to make it in than some of the ones on my list? What would be your proposals for how to do certain cultures that I mentioned? Do you think that my quick mock-ups of how I might approach these were reasonably compelling? I know I couldn't give tons of information, but hopefully it was enough for you to get some idea of where I would go with it. And yeah, don't forget to go vote in the polls that I just posted in the community tab. They're going to influence the Age of Mythology content you guys are going to be seeing over the next couple months until Age of Mythology Retold is launched. And again, if you say that you don't want to see quite as much as I'm potentially proposing here, you can always make your voice heard on that front in the polls as well. So make sure you do that, and I hope that you, like me, enjoy waiting eagerly for the launch of Retold in September. But until then, my name is Robbie Howell, and ciao for now.